Hey guys, we are going to be talking about what motivates you today.
Yeah, this is part 3 of our 5-part series on God's will leaves you breadcrumbs. When we can bring all these breadcrumbs together, when we understand these different elements of God's will, we can have clarity on what he's calling us to do, what his plan is for our life. So we're going to be exploring motivations today, not just what you desire, but how you desire it. And guess what? You've got one that is particular to you.
Stick around. Hey guys, welcome back. We are continuing our series on
God's will leaves you breadcrumbs.
Yes.
Yes. So we get a lot of questions on how do I know God's will for my life? How do I trust my desires? How do I know where my desires end and God's desire begins? All those things. We're addressing that in this podcast. We get a lot in our Metanoia Catholic Academy. That's our group coaching area where please join us over at CatholicCoaching.com. You can learn more about that. But the piece with this podcast, what we're doing with this podcast is we're boiling things down to 4 elements of motivation. Or, excuse me, motivation is what we're talking about today, but it's 4 elements of God's will. Whereas if you can come to know each one of these elements, when you bring them together, you start to get a very clear picture of God's plan for your life and how God moves you and how the Spirit is moving you throughout your life. So we break it down these 4 elements because they're intelligible. All right. Last week, we dove into story, understanding our story. Today, we're going to be diving into the element of motivation. This is another one that we can learn about how we are motivated, not necessarily what we're motivated to, but how we are moved into action, right? So if we're going to bring God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, that is taking action. In a lot of ways, I was on retreat this weekend. And our priest, our retreat director, led us through this reflection on creation. He's like, it's almost as if God did 95% of creation and then stopped and then created man and said, okay, cultivate and care for the garden. Take it the next 5%. We're going to, part of your Imago days, we're going to co-create together. Well, that's an active action. That's an active participation, right? To be co-creative. So motivation is what moves us into action. And so when we explore the ways that we are motivated, we start to understand how God has designed us to take the next 5%, to be co-creative in the kingdom.
Yeah. And so today we're going to be talking about really giving you permission to look at your motivations. I don't know. There's a lot of thoughts about motivations and what we desire and how we desire.
And suspicion
there. And then we're also going to talk about have you guys look at your own unique motivations. Matt and I are going to share our unique motivations because that's an element here too. We have unique motivations. What Matt is motivated by is not the same that what I'm motivated by. And that is, I think, an amazing discovery.
Yeah, it's amazing also. And I think what I also love is what it does for our relationship. Because prior to like really diving into the understanding the unique motivations, and even M-Code is one of those assessments we're going to be talking about, the motivation code. All right, we had Josh Miller on our podcast a couple of months ago. He's one of the founders of that assessment. But when we don't look at our unique motivations, we can presume that everybody's motivated just as we are, right? And so when people are not motivated the way we are, we often tend to think something's wrong with them.
Or and that's like in a team setting, but maybe you're at a job that completely drains you and you don't know where your motivation comes from and you don't know that your motivations are intrinsic and that they change and that necessarily like things don't really create your motivations. They start interiorly first. Really good things to know.
Yeah, that's a really exciting point there about the intrinsic motivations. Is what that means, folks. It's like motivation isn't created for us by outside circumstances. So you can be motivated wherever you're at, even if it's not necessarily a job that you like, right? But you can't say it's the job's fault that you're not motivated because motivations are intrinsic. We're going to talk more about that as we get into this.
Yeah.
But let's get into it, Aaron. I think this is going to be an adventure. So like, you're going to learn something today about your particular motivations, why to consider these things, how you can dive a little bit deeper into these. We're going to have an understanding, some practical exercises that we're going to give you at the end of this so that you can start to explore your own intrinsic motivations as well. Certainly M-Code assessment is one of those ways of doing that, but we have a free way for you to be able to just do that as well. But let's get into just our word nerd and defining the terms that we're working with, Aaron.
Yeah. So motivate, actually, it's the same. It's a Latin word modus, which, locomotive, motive, anything like that.
Movement.
It moves us. It's movement. It's motion. If you look up the definition of the word motivation, it means it's the inner stimulus for action. So there's that intrinsic space that we're talking about. I think that's a really big piece here, because I was just listening to Todd Henry, who wrote the book Motivation Code, and he was talking about myths about motivations. And he said a lot of people think I have to be in the perfect job to feel motivated, or I have to do the perfect actions so I feel motivated. No, motivation is a form of desire. Desire is an emotion. Emotion, there's that word again. It's a desire, and that motivation comes from, that desire comes from a thought. So it starts interiorly, and it is very unique for every person here.
So what I love that Todd Henry and Josh Miller and their team did was they, like Aaron says, the motivation comes from a thought. Okay, well, some thoughts are going to motivate me and not motivate Aaron, or motivate you, listeners here, and vice versa. So in a lot of ways, what they've done is, with their M-Code assessment, they have they've actually given you like how to structure a thought that is going to be uniquely motivating for you. That's going to stir up desire for you, or aversion to you. So those are those two passions. We just got done with our series on the art of managing your emotions. We talked about aversion and desire. Both of those are the motivating passions. Why do we say they move you? They are movements that you have there. So we've also heard in sales before that people are moved to buy something by a promise of pleasure, right? A desire, or avoidance of some sort of pain. And so when you're in the sales pitch, you're kind of amplifying the pleasure, but also amplifying the pain, because we want them running away and running towards.
But everybody has different forms of pleasure and pain.
Right. So like, if you're a salesperson on this, or you're a coach and you want to get somebody to actually like listen in here, or your parent, goodness gracious, you're going to start becoming astute to what really drives your kids. Because that's how we start to shape good decisions and virtue and things like that. Okay, so important premises. I know when we say, okay, let's look at our motivations, what moves us. Or it's tough to talk about motivation without talking about desire. Okay, we're going to do our best here, because there are some distinctions. We're talking about how you're actually moved. That's what we mean by motivations, versus what you're moving towards. That's more desire.
Or your object of desire.
There can often be suspicion, right? Because we have been moved to do things and it hasn't really turned out the best way. Sometimes we could be moved towards something that's not necessarily good for us. We call that a vicious action. But some important premises here to really doing this work of assessing our the intentions behind our motivations and whether or not they're driving us towards something good. I want to invite you to consider, are you in the state of grace? All right. That's like premise number one. We're presuming here that you're in the state of grace. Number two, that you are actively pursuing virtue. Okay. The more we're pursuing virtue, the more our habits are inclining us towards the good, right? And that's just going to make it easier for us to
hear God's voice.
Trust these motivations as they start to move us, and we're moving and being able to assess if they're moving us the right direction. And then also like having a regular prayer life and participating in the sacraments. Those three things can like move us from a place of our motivations and our desires. Okay, motivations and desires are like 10% trustworthy, versus like they're 90% trustworthy. So when we're in those things, in the state of grace, we're pursuing virtue actively and intentionally, and then we have a prayer life and we are participating in the sacraments. Vastly different our ability to trust these movements, these interior movements. Why is it important to trust these things? Because if we're not going to trust the interior movements, then I think we're questioning the great promise of the gospel, of Christ actually giving us his Holy Spirit. All right. What does the Holy Spirit do? Like, the Holy Spirit living in us moves us. It's a participation. Grace is a participation in God's divine life. And the Holy Spirit moves us. And Christ gave us this advocate to teach us everything we need to know, remind him of everything he has said, and to move us towards our destiny, bring us back to the Father, right? So we experience that through these interior movements.
All right. So let me be clear on this. When we're in the state of grace, when we're in relationship with the Lord, when we're actively pursuing virtue and we're like staying close to the sacraments, we have permission to trust those motivations. I'm going to add one more thing.
Like greater permission.
Yes.
Like it's even
Can I add
prudent.
one more thing to that list? Not just relationship with the Lord, but your desire, your object of desire is God here. Okay. So remember, we're talking about that movement towards, if you listen to our podcast on desire, a key element to that desire, that emotion of desire, is knowing what you love, knowing what you're directing that desire towards. And so where we can really fall into confusion here is when maybe we're loving ourselves versus God, right? Maybe we are the object of desire versus God. And I say that word versus, and I want to kind of land there for a second, because a lot of times we can love ourselves as a fruit of our loving God. And that's actually probably the most proper way, right?
Yeah.
But when we love ourselves first and not God, we're leaving him out of it. So a great way to actually order our motivations is to say, what is the object of my desire here? Is it to love God and grow his kingdom? Is it to love God? And so that's just a great question for you to ask as you're discerning these.
Yeah, that's why it's difficult to divorce desire from motivations. But again, when we get into motivations, we're talking about how you get into movement, how you're driven to
how you are uniquely
you're really excited and moved,
driven. Yeah.
Right? Not necessarily what you're moving towards. Okay.
Yes.
And the final thing I'll say with this is, like, on this side of heaven, just know that there's going to be some weeds amongst the wheat in your desire, right? It takes an act of repentance and continual work. Our work moving towards something we desire is desiring it more perfectly for God's glory alone. We're only allowed really one attachment. It's God, right? And so we may understand that, like, I know when I'm pursuing, sometimes my vanity's mixed in there as well. That doesn't mean don't move. It means go to confession. That's what it means. Keep moving, trust in the Lord, trust in his redemption, offer it to the Lord for his perfection. Like, that's the work that we're doing here. And I think a great story again that came up from my retreat this weekend. And I think this encapsulates kind of the distinction that we're talking about here. Is the one of St. Ignatius himself. Okay, so most people know the story of St. Ignatius. I'll do a quick recap. Like, he was a knight and nobleman in Spain, I think, the 16th century, something like that. Doesn't matter. All right.
St. Ignatius of Loyola.
St. Ignatius of Loyola. Okay, so he's a knight, nobleman, and he just wanted glory. He wanted a life of glory, of damsel in distress, knight in shining armor, a lot of self-glorification. It was even to the point where he was, they were under attack. He was in a castle or some sort of citadel, and he had 29 other knights with him. And he convinced all of them that it is better to die an honorable death than to surrender to the French. Well, he leads a charge, and he's the first one out the gate, and immediately a cannonball smacks him in the knee, and he goes down, and the 29 other guys surrender at that point.
Run away.
All right, run away. So he's the French send him back over for a ransom, so he's at home recovering, and he realizes that they didn't set his knee very well, and he's going to have a limp. And so he convinces the doctors to do a very dangerous surgery. Again, think of the vainglory that's driving this, because he doesn't want to have a limp. To do a very dangerous surgery to break his leg again, no anesthesia, no antiseptics, and reset his leg. Well, they do this, and he gets an infection, a very terrible infection. And it's only through the intercession, as we understand it, of another family that had a dedication to St. Peter and Paul that he actually recovers, like miraculously recovers. But in that recovery, he starts reading some of these stories about the saints and the life of Christ. And so he spends his day daydreaming about these noble stories, but he doesn't have the books anymore. And then he goes and he reads some of these other books, and he spends 90% of his day thinking about those things, and then 10% thinking about Christ. and then it's 60-40, and then it's 50-50. And before you know it, he's just realizing that when he's thinking about Christ, he's thinking about the saints, he has a joy that lasts and it doesn't dissipate. And so he realizes this is the way he wants to go. And so he says, I still desire my glory, but I know this is the path that is going to attain my glory. This path of righteousness, this path of Christianity is going to be the way. And so what he does is he actually goes and does a big confession. Remember, that's step one. Go to confession, does a 2-day confession, and then he leaves his home, and he has somebody make him a makeshift peasant outfit, right? A designer peasant outfit, which is just hysterical.
Versace.
Because Versace peasant outfit, because he wants to be so humble. And he rides off, hides his armor, and then puts on this peasant outfit, and he goes off on a pilgrimage. And so think of this. He's being moved right now still for personal glory, but through God's grace alone, all right? The beautiful thing is on this pilgrimage, this is where he writes the spiritual exercises. Mm-hmm. And you think about the fruits of people that have experienced the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, abundant fruits, abundant clarity of like coming to know Christ. And here he was still at this point in his life. He was an AMDG. He wasn't for the greater glory of God. He was for his own glory, but this was just the means he was going about it. Still disordered, still weeds amongst the weeds.
Still moving though.
Still moving. And God worked with him still and brought about something great, a tremendous gift to the church, even amidst his vice. That's why we say, okay, like these movements, don't be overly suspicious of them and think that God can't work with them. He certainly worked with St. Ignatius. He can work with each one of us. Okay?
Yeah.
So now, like, knowing that our motivations are things that are unique and the Lord can still work with them, even when they're not perfect, it's like the question, do you think God wants you to get in touch with some of your own personal motivations?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think so. And I love that story because of just, and you said it, but I want to like emphasize it again, like his object of desire was moving throughout that story. It was going from, his object was himself at first. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of slowly started to move towards God. And like you said, even when he started his journey, even when you could say he started to become a saint, he still had self-focus. But then it turned into all for greater glory of God, AMDG, at that point, at the end of his life, which is awesome.
Yeah, and that only comes in that AMDG, folks, we can't self-generate that. That comes through an infusion of grace. And I tell you, like, where I've experienced this in my own life is with our journal. Right? Yeah. Exercise 3 in our journal, we call it contemplating our goals with God. And so we have these goals, we have these desires, we have these pursuits. And folks, sometimes there's some weeds amongst the wheat in terms of what moves us.
They need to be refined. They need to be refined. Right. I like to say that all the time. It's not the exception, it's the rule.
Yes. So just like trust it, be aware of it. But this is where the infused virtue of hope does its work. Okay? The theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, those are infused. We cannot generate them for ourselves. There's no acquired virtue of faith, hope, and love. Mm-hmm. It comes from God alone. And the beautiful thing about praying for that infused virtue of hope is actually purifies our desires so it can be AMDG. I'm doing this for God's glory alone. And I've experienced folks where it's like, I've got a goal and it is financial driven. It is self-serving. It is, I want to feel secure because I'm resting in some sort of, material provision. Mm-hmm. And that's how it started. And I recognize it. And it's like, okay, Lord, I repent of it. And over time, I can't tell you when it happened. Eventually, there's just this desire to do it regardless of whether I get those things or not for God's greater glory. And that's how it works. I mean, we can see that example even in St. Ignatius' life. So check out the journal here, folks.
Yeah, for sure.
And plug that. Okay.
Moving on to the next thing. We have particular motivations.
Yes.
Right? So as a human, we have universal motivations. We have universal desires. And that is for, sleep, food, drink, sex, like
survival.
I want to say, I don't think like sex is a desire to propagate the
sure, yeah. Like these are natural movements that we have.
Survival,
and I think
growth, justification.
Certainly we can look at those universal motivations, I guess you could say, or objects of desire and see, okay, like there's some revelation in here. Like, God wants the species to continue on.
Yes.
Right? Like he wants us to have life.
Yep.
Right. Okay. Then there's the particulars.
Yeah. And these are what get me most excited, actually.
Yeah.
So every person, let's talk about M code a little bit. I don't know a ton about it, but what I do know.
We know enough to give you a little bit of value here. We've taken the assessment and it's like
27. Awesome. There's 27. Like they've been studying this for years.
Yeah,
right?
about
like
50 years worth of data that they've been building on this. Yep.
The assessment's very cool too. They ask you to like for an achievement story. We'll get to that.
Well, it's a narrative-based assessment. Usually these assessments are all multiple choice, and that's how they do this, but they've woven in narrative, like your own personal narrative into it, which is I think one of the reasons why it's actually has a validity factor that's higher than even Clifton Strengths, which is amazing. We love Clifton Strengths, but it's actually has a very good, if you take this, it's the factor that they're measuring. If you take this again and again, you're going to end up with the same results. Like it's higher than that of Clifton Strengths. So
yeah. So basically what your motivations are is like you're just identifying what uniquely drives you, what gets you into that motion. Like we were saying, like motivation means motion, but like what actually uniquely describes you or drives you, helps you gain like awareness of why you do the things that you do, gives you greater productivity, greater collaborative effort and effectivity. Makes you a better leader. There's like a lot of things. So once you can kind of like identify what motivates you, suddenly you feel so seen. That was our experience. Yes. It was like, oh my goodness, more so than the strengths test, more so than even the temperaments. Temperaments are like very much like your disposition, how you were born, like your launch pad. It covers
a broad range of things. So you can get a lot from temperaments, but like this assessment
so unique.
Gets pretty dialed in on what motivates you, which is cool.
Yeah. But what I love about this too is it really helps you identify what gives you a deep sense of meaning in your life and the work that you do. And so my top 3 are be unique. And I'll describe each one of them. Okay. So my number 1 was be unique. And I seek to distinguish myself from others by displaying some talent, quality, or aspect that is distinctive and special. Now, I could take that be unique and become very self-focused. I could also take that be unique and say, okay, Lord, how can we go about evangelizing in a unique way? How can we go about teaching people in a unique way? How can we go about influencing people in a unique way? And I am nodding to my other 2 motivators here. My other motivator here is influencing behavior. I am motivated to gain reaction or response from people that indicates I have influenced their thinking, feeling, and behaviors. And so I'm also motivated by that. And so I can have that object of desire be for God and like to build up his kingdom. And that's going to look very different from if it's a vicious end goal being like, I want to, influence people to do what I say. I want to manipulate people to do what I say.
Yeah. Well, also how you go about doing it too is going to be different. So say for example, I got invited to be on a board, right? And it was a board for an orphanage over in Uganda. And it's like, I love the mission, right? And it really feeds a motivation that I have, which is like make an impact. That's my number 2 on my assessment. But then also like be key is a big part of it. So be key. Like I would not be motivated to be on this board. Like I love the mission, but I would not feel motivated to be on this board if I didn't think I had an opportunity to really be key in some of the decisions that were made and like even structuring some of the way that we operate, because that's another piece. I like to be an architect. I like to really take a vision and put flesh on it. Those are 2 other motivations of mine. So like you can see how like that desire to be key, to make an impact, to they start to work together. And then even you can see I'm getting energized thinking about this. But some people and that's going to impact how I actually show up. Like I want to be part of those conversations about where we're going. I want to be part of putting the structure in place and researching the elements that we can have. Like even I got tasked out with researching like our email system. that we have. Like that's an element of architecture that I can put together with this.
Yeah.
So like those are knowing that and knowing that I'm getting to lean into those things, I can start to really be energized to participate well on this board. What's going up? What's going on?
Nothing.
Okay. You want to talk?
No, I just want to get back to telling my other motivator.
Oh, okay. I was a little motivated to be key.
Be key.
There.
Showed up. Which is actually in my top 5 too. But yeah, so okay. So Matt just gave you an example of all of the ways that he uses your top. What are your top?
Well, I'll
finish mine.
Yeah, you finish yours.
I will finish mine and then we'll go and do you. Okay.
Yeah.
So demonstrate new learning. That's my third one here. I'm motivated to learn how to do something new and to show that I can do it. And when I went through this assessment with one of my coaches, with an M-code facilitator, what I noticed by this one, I was really motivated to give to others. It was that piece where it wasn't just showing people that I could do it. It was like gifting other people with the same ability to do it. And that's where I saw the influencing others kind of coming into play with this one. So it was collaborative with that. And from these 3 motivations, I look back and I'm like, wow, okay, so creating a coach training, a Catholic coach training that didn't exist before. So there's that be unique piece. And then bringing in the how to influence behavior, which is really funny because one of the core things that we do is help people find out their thinking, feeling, and actions. And that's in the description of influencing behavior. And then the demonstrating new learning, like learning it for myself and then imparting that what I've learned onto my students and the coaches that I coach and teach. It's like I see all 3 of these just coming to life in what I'm doing.
Which is why you produce so much and you're like never out of energy.
Never stopping.
So like, we try to make, I've tried because I like to have the structure in place and stability and things like that. And Aaron just wants to keep creating stuff. And so it's tough you have to constantly be building structure to accommodate the creativity. And it's kind of like, all right, this is in our DNA. So like, I'm just going to accept this. And it's actually pretty awesome too. Because it expands the mission, it expands the impact. And so it's like I found leaning into my make an impact motivation, something where it's like at first I was averse to creating more. So like there's that motivation, aversion, right? Showing up. But because the thought I had was like, this is actually making things more difficult. Okay. But rather now I was like, oh no, this is actually creating more value and it's actually making a greater impact, like helping Metanoia Catholic make a greater impact by uncapping her creative potential here. It's like, okay, now I'm motivated and I'm desiring more of that. So like I'm motivated to kind of create a space for Aaron and to even like do the hard work sometimes of like, building more structure or making more investments to be able to, or doing another marketing campaign to be able to make space for you to create that value.
Could you tell me your top 3 and then the descriptions of them?
Sure,
and see how they could be like self-serving, but then also when they're pointed towards God, how can we do that? Okay,
so be key is my number 1. And I know also my root sin is vanity. So I can see how be key, right? Which is like you are motivated to be a key person who holds things together and gives the meaning and or direction. I can see how vanity can play in there. So like that's part of my own program of life is like working against that vanity, but at the same time, not dismissing that I desire to be key and that God has made that my motivation to be key. Number 2, make an impact. You seek to shape and impact the world around you. Okay. Yeah. Number 3, realize the vision. You take a vision or concept and make it a reality.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
That is like so you, actually. Like,
yes.
Even just the type of coach you are, like even from our niche test.
I'm a visionary coach.
Like number 1, you're a visionary. And then, but also if we brought in like the strengths and everything, like you're an executor too, which I can really see you're number 2, make an impact.
Yep.
Is like, how do we make this concrete? How do we actually put this? And the vision one too, where it's like taking that vision, that lofty thing, and then making it concrete, making it a reality.
Yeah. And then, like, I guess my 4 and my 5 are like, my 4 is architect. You create a plan using your technical expertise and then advise and oversee specialists in execution of that plan. All right. And then number 5, design. You're inspired by taking a vision or big picture plan and giving it form, feeling, and depth through a concrete design. I look at what we did with VCC and how I literally lost 20 pounds.
Because you forgot to eat.
I forgot to eat. Like, I was so motivated. I had the vision.
Yeah.
Like, there was like the whole make an impact. That was a part of it. It was amidst COVID. Churches were shut down. Speakers were sitting on their butts. Like, like people just wanted an outlet to be able to share and inspire. And like, and it was also like taking expertise to be able to kind of orchestrate this and help people know what they had to do to make it happen. And all those pieces came together so beautifully, and it was just a beautiful symphony at the end of it. And so, like, but I was so motivated throughout it. And then there was faith that was behind it, and there was a sincere desire to be gift that was feeling it too. There's so much grace in that moment, and it went viral. 64,000 people later. It was big.
Yeah. So how could you kind of take one of those, the make an impact, or even the third one? Because you kind of give an example. What's the third one? Oh, the vision.
Realize the vision.
Yeah. Like, how could those show up in a vicious way and then a virtuous way? Like, we kind of get an example.
Yeah. So like, realize the vision. Virtuous. Like, when we go virtuous and vicious, I like to think of virtuous is when we go interdependent, right? And when we go vicious, we go independent, dependent, or codependent, right? So it's all relative to relationship here. So what does create the vision look like in an interdependence? It's being open to other people to contribute to it. And it's like, but you have a gift of being able, and like, you're motivated to find clarity with that vision and integrity with that vision. I know that's how mine shows up. And so where it can show up viciously is if I just say, you know what, Aaron, I don't want your input. And like, that crushes you because you love collaboration. You love to be key as well. And so like,
and also I'm high ideation.
And also you're high ideation. And so it's just like, it's just kind of dumb for me not to do that. So, but it's also very prideful for me not to do that. So I can go independent and
like, it's my vision. Sorry, everyone.
Like, we're building out another program that I'm so excited about. Because
I think it's that one. I think it's your number 3.
It's going to take all this stuff here. Like, if you're enjoying this podcast series, it's going to take it and it's going to make it super practical, and it's going to give you such clarity on God's plan for your life. Love it. It's going to make a huge impact, which I'm super motivated. But like,
huge.
I recognize that I might be central. Like, I really wanted this to be my baby. And so I was closed off to Aaron. I was closed off to collaborating with other people. And even from my retreat, I had this vision for another program that the Lord kind of laid on my heart. And I said, what do I do? What's the lamp unto my feet? And the Lord was just so amazing. He just says, I want you to share it with your friend Ryan, with Aaron, with your team. Like, just share it with people. Don't act on it. Don't start going independent, because you have the tendency to do that. But like, keep it open so that we can stay in a virtuous place with these motivations. And already I'm starting to experience the fruits of living out that visionary interdependently, right? But I'm still using that motivation, that way that I'm motivated. And being visionary, I'm like making an impact, being central. But like, sometimes being central is being central to making space for other people to contribute. Yeah.
I love it.
So there's something, but like, here's like one of the things that they brought up, Aaron, and you highlighted this is, like it's intrinsic, these motivations. And it, like, the desires may change, right?
Our values will change. Our object of our desire will change throughout our lives. Hopefully, will turn into, like, similar to St. Ignatius's story. It will turn into, that object of desire will be for God. But we're also, pilgrims on the way, right?
Yeah.
And so that will start to change throughout your life. But that way that you desire, that how you desire, how you are motivated, that doesn't change, like, at all. There's people who take this test, like a 10-year gap, and it is identical, the results of this test, because it just doesn't change. And it's funny, looking at these motivations, I look back in my life and I'm like, yep, that showed up there, that showed up there, that showed up there. And it's all of these like achievement stories, these stories that felt like such fulfillment in my life. And because I was always very different, even when I, like some things that always showed up were like performances, like being in front of people, doing something new, something different that nobody's ever done before, but also bringing a team in and being like, hey, you'd be great here. And oh my goodness, aren't you so excited about that? And then like, here's how you do it. Here's how you do this dance move. It's just funny. I'm thinking of my achievement stories and they're kind of small and like little. I know it's a thought, but there's a lot of people who would be like, that is not an achievement story. I'm like, it was for me. I was in complete flow and I was totally motivated to get it done. And I didn't have those experiences in school. Like I wasn't motivated to learn, I don't know, calculus. Like I just wasn't. Like that was not a thing. But I'm sure if it was like, hey, Erin, can you learn calculus in your own unique way and also influence others as you're doing? I'm like, that would have been a very different approach.
Can you can you think of a unique and fun way for you and a group of people to learn this calculus?
Right. I'd be like, yes, I think I could do that. Right. And then I'd probably learn it, but as a byproduct. I wouldn't want to be learning it, but I would be like, I can do that. I can definitely help with that way.
Yeah. And so you notice this with your kids too, right? For parents that are out there or people that are teachers that got students, like some kids you can be like, hey, I'm gonna do the timer, right? And we're gonna get as many toys picked up as possible. And Marcus said, go. And like they're driven, they're moved by this because they maybe they're motivated by
a challenge.
Like overcoming a challenge.
Yeah.
Right.
Meet the challenge
is one of those things. But maybe some of those, like the kids go like, like they're just dragging through it because this is too much pressure for them. And maybe it's just like, okay, like what is a creative way that we can find to put these toys away and be very, very silly about it. Right. And it's just like, okay, like I remember even, Avila, she didn't want to get dressed one morning. And it's like, okay, when we put your shirt on, as soon as your head pops out, you need to make a funny face and like make me laugh, right? And who knows, maybe influence others is like one of her motivations.
I think it is.
Okay. All right.
Certainly.
Apples don't fall far from the tree.
Yeah.
So like, but you start to discover what moves your people, right? And you start to appreciate that as well.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about dopamine? Because dopamine is really the thing
before we get
people.
We get into dopamine and like maybe you hit it already. These motivations, they're not going to change, folks.
Yeah, I did.
And here's the thing too, like they're not circumstance based too. So you can still be in a job where you don't necessarily find the mission very inspiring for you or desirable for you. But you can still lean into these unique motivations.
You can leverage them.
And it will still generate the motivational energy to do what needs to get done.
Yes.
Okay. There are things that we have to do still that we don't necessarily particularly enjoy doing, but we can still be motivating. So motivating doesn't mean that you're enjoying it or like you're taking a deep pleasure with it, but you can still be moved into action to do what needs to be done. And so like say for me and like be key, it's like, okay, how can I leverage be key in this situation where I don't necessarily feel like doing this, right? And that sends my brain on a mission. Or how can I be the designer? How can I be the architect? How can I be, make an impact or something like that? So you start to send your brain on a mission to think of those thoughts that leverage those, well, I can make an impact by blah, and then that will generate some motivational energy for you. Okay, that's how you leverage the
I have a couple examples in my life if I could share them.
Yeah,
like as a coach, I know that I need to go write content, and I know that I have a lot of ideas and I need to get them out on paper, but it can kind of like hit some of these motivations, and I probably could leverage these more in those moments, but I do feel very drained when I leave that. And that is, guys, that's a key indicator. If you're energized after you've kind of been motivated to do something. Like energy.
After you've done it. After you've done the act.
is an indicator. Excitement is an indicator that you are kind of being motivated. You are hitting something on your one of your core motivations. But even after I've written for a little bit, I'm like just feel drained. And I think it's because I don't have that influencing behavior. I don't have that influencing others in that moment. One of my favorite things to do is to try things out live with people. Like I notice a difference. You get
feedback.
Yes, because I get immediate feedback and I can see people's faces. I can see people's comments at least. I'm like, okay, so like this is something that is highly motivating to me. So if I'm creating content or trying out new content, I want an audience, a group of people, so I can read people, even if it's just one person. I want that. I noticed the difference between us. We did a live. We'll do Instagram lives, and I love the lives because there's that interaction. And I'm like, oh yeah, we're moving people. Like, yeah, let's do this. Versus a pre-recorded video. Because I remember saying to you, I'm like, I had a hard time with podcasting, and it was mainly because I had to be the one that was like organizing everything. It just, time, right? You were still working at VCC. And so I felt like it was a lot on me. And some of these other motivations, like organizing, is very low for me.
Well, even like getting it done. That's one of those motivations. Like, and that's like you were like leaning into that. And I was like, and that's not even really super high for me. As much as I like high executor themes and Clifton Strengths, but but you were leaning on that getting it done. And when you were leaning on getting it done, like so draining, deflating, like all of a sudden, and then the stress comes up, the time crunch gets up when you're trying to lean on that motivation.
But we've switched it. Now we're doing these together. We're creating these podcasts together, which is why they're so much better now.
Yes,
they are. I think they are, but and I've been enjoying it.
Well, what we've done is we have changed circumstances. You might be thinking like, well, you've changed circumstances. That's what makes it better. Well, ideal conditions is one of those elements we're going to talk about in this series as well. They can be really helpful to kind of making it easy to live in that motivation zone.
Yes.
So it's not all just mindset work that you're doing. Sometimes, like when you can't change the circumstances, mindset work is really your work to do.
I would say always do mindset work first.
Oh yeah.
Always. That is primary. So find out what motivates you, like utilize it. Don't automatically change your conditions, especially if you can't, but yeah, I think there are certain ideal conditions that could help you leverage your motivations quicker and more efficiently. So
yes.
Yeah, that's my example. So it's like, just notice those areas in your life where you're feeling totally drained, and then notice those areas in your life where you're completely in flow and you've forgotten to eat.
Yes. Awesome. Okay. So let's talk dopamine, and then we'll get into a prac app as we wrap up here. Okay. So dopamine, we've been listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman quite a bit. He's got a podcast. He's a neurologist or neuroscientist.
I don't know.
Neurologist, I believe. Over at
I think.
At Stanford University. But I love what he does. He just wants to make that brain science very practical and accessible for people. So check that out. I nerd out on this stuff. But he starts talking about dopamine. All right. So dopamine, perhaps you're familiar with this. It's a like a hormone, right? Or it's like some sort of chemical in our body. All right. And I'm not the scientist here. So
yeah.
It's a pleasure chemical. All right. So when you open up your Instagram and you see 400 likes on your post, you're going to feel pleasure. Like there's gonna be a little dopamine release that's there. And like that dopamine release, it's what fills you with that sense of pleasure that's there. So oftentimes we associate dopamine release with when we're pursuing a goal, when we've arrived at the goal. And there can be a dopamine release. There certainly is a dopamine release that's there. But really there's dopamine that's being released throughout the journey here as well. And what the amazing thing is about dopamine release is really mindset driven, right? It's very subjective. It's not something where like you can create this cocktail or create your circumstances and then that's what causes the dopamine to release. He talks about this. Dopamine is very subjective. What does that mean? Like we have unique ways that we're motivated, right? My B central is something that releases dopamine for me, right? That it motivates me. Okay, why do I know this? Because dopamine doesn't just stop at pleasure. What it does is actually the molecular components in dopamine are also the building blocks of epinephrine. All right, epinephrine is an adrenaline. It gets us into movement, right? It's a hormone that gets us into movement at this point. So the dopamine, the pleasure, the desire, right? You can't separate motivation from desire. The object of desire creates the dopamine, all right? And you get to choose what that object of desire is. Mm-hmm. And then that is what that dopamine molecule can convert into the epinephrine. That's what gets us into movement. Adrenaline gets us into movement.
So epinephrine is more so technically the motivation molecule?
Yeah. Like that's the movement molecule. So it's like desire molecule is the dopamine, and then the movement molecule or the movement chemical is more the epinephrine. And so cool. I don't know if this is science, like I don't think there's a studies there, but like something that helps me think about it is like, okay, so I want to get into movement. I want to get that epinephrine going. It means I need to have something that I desire.
Goal setting.
But then it's also like that the way that my motivation code works sustains that desire and the epinephrine releasing in my body. It's almost like, I wonder if this is just how God has designed dopamine and epinephrine to release in my body.
Yeah.
I wonder. And that would make
so cool.
Yeah, because if that's the case, then God has designed me to live out because each one of these motivations causes you to show up differently. Like God has designed my body to respond chemically in the way that he wants me to make his presence known in the world. Yeah. Like we talked about in the beginning of the podcast, take creation to the final 5% to completion, cultivate and care for the garden. So my unique path for cultivating and caring for the garden is going to conform to my unique design for producing epinephrine and dopamine, which is going to conform to my unique motivational codes and the desires that God has placed on my heart, right? And the more we can, and a tree by its fruits here, folks. So like always discernment going forth with this. But again, if we're in a state of grace, we're pursuing virtue intentionally, we are have that regular prayer life and participating in the sacraments, we can trust these things more.
Yeah.
Right? We can start trusting them a little bit more. And we always have confession to be able to fall back on when we get it wrong. Okay? But remember St. Ignatius. He didn't have it perfect, and he created the Ignatian exercises, which have transformed our church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
And he became a saint in the process.
Yes.
That movement, guys, we can't. I think my favorite thing about movement in the coaching world, right? Like one of the things that kind of makes us distinct as coaches is we help other people get into action, get into movement.
Towards an objective.
Yeah. Towards a good objective. And so I think that's a big piece, but also in like the Catholic faith, I think so often we can kind of over spiritualize things and not make our faith incarnate, not through action, not make it incarnate through action. And so we can be stuck. And a lot of people come to us, at Metanoia Catholic, and they're like, I'm stuck. And this is a piece of it. It's like, okay, so first of all, you just have to start moving, right? Because with action comes clarity. A little bit more action.
And comes growth. And comes grace.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we need to just kind of get you moving. But for you to understand your unique desires, what compels you to move immediatay is such a hack, I think.
Yeah.
Is such like what creates that epinephrine in you.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes.
This is
very cool.
I'm such a fan.
So where do we start? Where do you start to explore your unique motivation? Certainly you can go get the M-Code assessment. We're actually working on, it looks like there's an opportunity to maybe, we're exploring on how we might be able to tie this into more of the work that we do.
Yeah.
So we're in conversations with them now.
Such a piece.
But you can certainly go, it's about $90 right now to be able to go and take that assessment. Certainly feel free to do that. But what they ask actually are these things called achievement stories. Remember we said it's one of those assessments that takes in narrative.
It's so cool.
And it makes that part of the assessment. So it's very personalized, I think, in that sense. So, Aaron, what's an exercise that people can start doing at home that can get them exploring or questioning or curious about how they are motivated?
Yeah. So just a couple questions that you can ask is, what was an achievement from a particular part of your life. So something like an achievement story, you would consider it an achievement story. And it doesn't matter how big or small it is. It could be like super teeny tiny, like those were some of mine, but it just kind of comes up. And I do like the ones that were from far away, like a long time ago, like when you were a child, maybe at different sections of your life, like when you're a child, maybe when you're a teenager, and then maybe when you're an adult. So pick a time where you're like, this was a great achievement. And don't judge yourself.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be a big one, like Aaron said before, or other people don't have to acknowledge it. It doesn't matter if some other people acknowledge it as an achievement or not.
Yeah.
Like it's a personal, I personally find this as a, like, I'm calling this an achievement.
Yes. Yeah. And also like know that you were kind of in flow. Like you were just like, I am exactly where I need to be right now.
Yeah.
What did you do in that moment? Like what were the actions that you did? What did you achieve in your mind? What did you achieve? And why was it fulfilling to you? And just kind of start to write those out. These will prepare you for if you do take the test, the M-Code test. And then you'll be able to like identify some of those motivators.
But I went through this just kind of these questions before taking M-Code. The site was down for a little bit. And so I just went ahead and made some of these achievement stories after reading the book. And you'll be able to start seeing some things show up. Like even the book that they've got that breaks down all the different types.
The motivation code. I already knew that I was high in Be Unique.
Yes.
Like before I even took it.
But like it was, I used to really have a hard time before this. Like I often say like, I'm not a joiner. I don't join other people's programs like unless I think it's going to give me something that I can take and contribute to my own program, right? That's like the architect in me. I want to take areas of expertise and kind of put it together, put it to use someplace else. But like I've always found it not, it's not very motivating for me to join just a parish men's group. Unless I started the parish men's group, like unless I was like a key leader and like my Be Central was something that was there. So I just, it allowed me to kind of hold the space for that a little bit. But also knowing that, like, okay, that's why I didn't necessarily feel motivated because I didn't perceive that I had an opportunity to be central here. Is there a way for me to look at this parish men's group and still not be in charge, but still be motivated by being central? Maybe it's being central in like the small group discussion.
Yeah.
Like I get to be central in the small, like, and help be central to one person having like their own metanoia moment. Like, wow, that would really make an impact on that person's life. And even now I can start to feel like knowing that I'm motivated by that, I can start to look at something and I can start to consider a way that I could feel inclined to move towards it, and not just say like, oh, that doesn't motivate me, and just say, and then write it off. Right?
Yes.
Because it could be something that's very good and you just need to do a little bit of work.
You can leverage these. You can leverage these motivations. Like yesterday, a coach asked me, we were doing practice coaching, and she asked me, she's like, she is a strengths coaching call. How do you show up uniquely? She didn't even know that this was my number one motivation, but how do you show up uniquely in your connectedness? And I was like, oh, I love that question, because and that's just a way to leverage. I'm so motivated
to answer that question right now.
Right. So you can leverage these motivations, even just as using them as words, in questions and guided questions.
Exactly how you use them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's exactly how you use them. Like, and it's exactly how I know this about Aaron now. So I ask those questions like that. So like, hey, what's like a unique way that we can do this? Or like, what's a way that we can, like think of the stuff that you've already gathered together and like, how can you bring some of your learning into this conversation, into this brainstorming session right now? How can we really be collaborative about this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. All right, folks, you've got your work to do. So like start with those achievement stories.
You have permission to be motivated by your unique motivations. So
if you're not motivated, that's your fault. All right. Like that's the other thing too. And that's like, there's hope in that. Like
such hope.
You can.
That's good news and bad news.
Good news and bad news.
Mainly good news.
Yeah, we do that quite a bit on this podcast.
Yeah.
So take responsibility for those things that motivate you.
Yeah. And just start leveraging them. Lean into them a little bit more. Yeah. And I think that's it.
Yeah. Next week, we're going to be talking about another element, and that's going to be the more the gifts and the contributions and the strengths. Okay. So it's another element. So now we're getting into the specifically like where have we acted in a certain way and it's borne fruit, right? So these like when we compare motivations, what really drives us with those things that are very fruitful in our lives, we have rocket fuel here, folks, versus motivations where we're not really good at something. It's just like, okay, well, you can be really driven, but not get a whole lot accomplished. But like pairing those things up together. And then when we get to ideal conditions, like creating those ideal conditions, remember, cultivate and care for the garden. And like, the story that the Lord is writing in your life, boom, like this is clarity on God's will and God's plan for your life.
So we'll see you there.
All right. See you next week. Bye. Hey, thanks for sticking with us in the Catholic Coaching Podcast. If you like what you heard,
please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again.